He thought $100 million would buy him another night of laughter, another easy victim in a room full of people too rich to care. But Victor Langford had no idea that before the chandeliers dimmed, his own smile would die in front of every billionaire who once envied him. The annual Langford Elite Capital Gala was never really about philanthropy, despite the polished banners and scripted speeches about innovation. It was a theater of ego, a glittering Manhattan ballroom where hedge fund kings, venture capital giants, and luxury moguls gathered to watch Victor perform the one thing he loved more than making money, making people feel small. Crystal glasses chimed beneath gold lights. Women in designer gowns laughed too loudly. Men in black tuxedos compared acquisitions like children comparing trophies. At the center of it all stood Victor Langford, 52, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, wearing a midnight velvet jacket that practically announced his wealth before he spoke a single word. His reputation was legendary, not just because he had turned a collapsing logistics company into a $10 billion empire, but because he enjoyed public challenges. Every gala, he selected someone he considered beneath the room, offered an impossible contest, and turned their failure into elite entertainment. Last year it had been a young software founder. The year before, a nervous analyst from Chicago. Tonight, the crowd expected another sacrifice. They always did. Near the far wall, beside a row of waiters balancing silver trays of champagne, stood Clara Bennett. 37 years old. Plain blue dress. Low heels. Hair tied back with no attempt at glamour. She held a sparkling water instead of wine and kept her eyes lowered enough that no one would feel compelled to speak to her. Which was fine. People had ignored Clara Bennett her entire life before they learned better. A woman in diamonds brushed past her and muttered, "Catering entrance is probably downstairs." Two men near the marble column glanced at Clara's dress and smirked as if she were a misplaced assistant. Clara said nothing. Her expression never changed. Her calmness, if anyone had bothered to study it, was not discomfort. It was patience. Across the ballroom, Victor was finishing his keynote, basking in applause that sounded more expensive than sincere. "Tonight," he announced, lifting one hand, "we do what this room does best. We reward brilliance." A murmur of excitement rippled through the guests. Screens descended from the ceiling. Investors leaned forward. Victor's lips curled slowly, because he understood suspense better than most television producers. 6 months ago, he continued, "My top quantitative division built a live market collapse simulation tied to 12 international sectors. 47 analysts. 3 Nobel economists consulted. No one has solved the chain reaction in under 10 minutes. So tonight," he snapped his fingers, and a giant number illuminated the ballroom in glowing gold. $100 million. Gasps swept through the room. A few people laughed in disbelief. Someone nearly spilled champagne. Victor spread his arms. $100 million to anyone in this room who can stop the collapse before total wipeout. The room buzzed like a casino floor. Billionaires loved money less than they loved impossible odds. Several guests whispered names of MIT graduates and Wall Street prodigies. Victor enjoyed every second of it. Then, while scanning the sea of eager faces, his eyes drifted past the diamonds, past the tuxedos, past the people who actually belonged there, until they landed on the one woman no one had noticed. Clara Bennett. Plain. Silent. Forgettable. His smile sharpened instantly. He had found tonight's entertainment. He pointed across the ballroom. "You there?" he called, his voice carrying with surgical precision. "Would you care to try your luck?" Heads turned all at once. And for the first time that night, every eye in the room found Clara Bennett. For 3 full seconds, Clara Bennett did not move. She stood with one hand wrapped around her glass of sparkling water while 200 of the wealthiest people in Manhattan turned to examine her like she was an unexpected stain on polished marble. Victor Langford's grin widened. He loved this part, the slow public inspection, the silent agreement spreading through the room that the chosen target did not belong. A woman near the front lifted her jeweled brows and whispered to her husband, who invited her. Someone else chuckled, maybe she wandered in from accounting. The laughter began as scattered sparks, then rolled wider as guests took in Clara's plain navy dress, her simple low bun, the complete absence of diamonds, labels, or social confidence. She looked nothing like the women who normally stood beneath these chandeliers. She looked like someone who mailed utility payments on time and shopped with a list. Exactly the kind of woman Victor knew his audience would underestimate. Clara slowly placed her untouched drink onto a passing silver tray. Her face remained unreadable, almost soft, as if she had not yet decided whether this was insult or invitation. Victor raised his microphone. "Come now," he said, voice dripping with false warmth, "do not be shy. $100 million could change a life." The room rewarded him with obedient laughter. Clara lifted her eyes toward the stage. They were grey, steady, and strangely undisturbed. She began walking. The sound of her heels on the ballroom floor was quiet, but in the sudden hush it seemed to click louder than the orchestra in the corner. She passed rows of men whose watches cost more than most American homes. She passed women who shifted their purses slightly, as though simplicity itself might be contagious. Victor watched her approach with growing satisfaction. Up close, she looked even more harmless than he expected. No designer perfume. No expensive confidence. No visible irritation. Just a composed woman stepping into a trap everyone else could already see. "Your name?" Victor asked, once she reached the stage. "Clara Bennett," she answered. Her voice was low, clear, and without tremor. Victor nodded theatrically. "Miss Bennett, are you employed in finance?" "No," a few guests snorted. "Economics?" "No." "Technology?" "No." Victor tilted his head. "Then perhaps this is instinct." "I admire courage." More laughter. Clara simply waited. There was something unnerving in the way she refused to help the room humiliate her. Victor turned and gestured to the enormous curved screens now glowing behind him. Streams of numbers flashed in red and white. Stock indexes. Commodity crashes. Shipping interruptions. Currency failures. 12 interlocked sectors collapsing in a simulation his analysts had been promoting for months as unsolvable under pressure. "Here are the rules," Victor announced. "This simulation predicts a full institutional wipeout in 10 minutes. 47 experts have failed to prevent it. If you can stabilize all 12 sectors before total collapse, the 100 million is yours." A murmur spread again, this time mixed with genuine disbelief. Several guests leaned forward, now more interested in the machine than in Clara. Victor handed her a sleek digital stylus connected to the central console. "Of course," he added with a smirk, "if this becomes too technical, no one will blame you for stepping away." He expected retreat. They always retreated eventually. Clara accepted the stylus and turned toward the screens. Her fingers did not shake. Her shoulders did not stiffen. Instead, she studied the cascading data with the same quiet focus someone might use reading a grocery receipt. 10 seconds passed. Then 20. Victor glanced toward the audience, already preparing his next joke. But before he could speak, Clara asked a question so calm, so precise, that 3 hedge fund managers in the front row sat upright at once. "Why," she said, "I still on the numbers, did your analysts model the Pacific freight freeze as a secondary reaction when it is clearly the primary trigger?" The ballroom lost its laughter. Victor Langford blinked once, and for the first time that evening, his polished smile faltered by half an inch. It was a small movement, barely visible unless someone knew how deeply he trusted his own control. Clara Bennett had not touched the console yet. She had not entered a single command. She had only looked at the data for less than 30 seconds and asked the one question no one in his elite quantitative division had raised in 6 months. In the front row, Martin Sloan, founder of Sloan Global Investments, slowly lowered his champagne glass. Beside him, a silver-haired economist narrowed his eyes at the Pacific freight chart now pulsing in red. Victor gave a short laugh, but it came out thinner than before. "Interesting observation," he said, rolling one shoulder as if unconcerned. But identifying a line item is not the same as solving a systemic collapse. Clara finally turned to face him. It is when the entire cascade was built on the wrong first domino. A hush moved through the ballroom. Not dramatic, not sudden, but creeping, like expensive fabric being drawn over a room. Victor gestured grandly toward the console. "Please," he said, smiling again for the audience, "educate us." Clara stepped closer to the touch screen. Numbers streamed across her face in white and crimson reflections. She lifted the stylus and circled 3 sectors: Pacific freight, semiconductor delays, and agricultural futures. "Your model assumes consumer banking panic begins after energy disruption," she said. "That is incorrect. The panic starts here, 42 hours earlier, when Pacific Freight locks medical chip imports and hospital procurement algorithms trigger emergency bond liquidations." There was a sharp intake of breath somewhere near the investors' table. One of Victor's own senior analysts leaned toward another and whispered, "Did she just connect hospital procurement to municipal bond pressure?" Clara continued before anyone could interrupt. Her voice never rose. It did not need to. The room was listening now with the uncomfortable concentration of people realizing the joke may have shifted direction. "Once those bonds dump," she said, drawing a clean line across the simulation, "insurance funds tighten liquidity, which forces regional lenders into automated withdrawal limits. That creates the public panic. Not energy. Banking fear." She tapped the screen. Instantly, one of the flashing collapse branches reorganized itself. The 10-minute wipeout timer paused, flickered, and reset to 8 minutes with a new probability tree. A visible murmur spread. Victor's head snapped toward the display. That was not supposed to happen without executive override. He recovered quickly enough to chuckle, but his fingers tightened around the microphone. "A fortunate guess," he said. "Models can react to any variable input." Clara glanced at him, and for the first time there was the faintest suggestion of something in her eyes. Not anger. Not pride. Recognition. Like a teacher realizing the loudest student in class had not done the reading. "No," she replied softly. "Not any variable. Only the hidden parent trigger." 3 members of Victor's quantitative team were standing now. One had taken out his phone calculator. Another was whispering rapidly, checking her logic against the side monitor. Victor saw them, and the warmth drained from his chest. This was no longer decorative entertainment. Clara moved the stylus again, opening a subpanel buried 2 layers beneath the public simulation dashboard. Several analysts gasped. That menu was not visible to guests. "How did she access Tier 3, someone muttered. Clara ignored the voices. "Your experts have been patching symptoms," she said, entering a sequence of reallocation so quickly the room could barely follow. "Shipping reroute through Vancouver. Temporary pharmaceutical credit release. Delay municipal bond liquidation by 6 hours. Freeze regional withdrawal messaging until insurance stabilization." She hit confirm. The red sectors on screen began changing. One by one. Crimson to amber. Amber to pale gold. The ballroom, moments ago filled with mocking laughter, now held only the hum of servers and the sound of Victor Langford forgetting to breathe. The main collapse clock, which had been screaming downward in angry red digits only moments before, now slowed to a measured amber pulse. 8 minutes became 7:43. 7:43 became 7:51. On the giant screens above the ballroom, the words "total system failure" shifted to conditional stabilization. Nobody spoke. The silence was so complete that the faint clink of ice settling in a forgotten whiskey glass sounded unnaturally loud. Clara Bennett remained focused on the console as if she were adjusting an office spreadsheet on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Her fingers moved with clean efficiency, opening windows, rerouting variables, stripping away assumptions Victor's specialists had treated like gospel. Every few seconds another sector changed color. Agricultural futures stopped flashing. Insurance volatility narrowed. Regional banking contagion dropped 12%, then 19%, then 26%. Each tiny correction landed like a private slap across Victor Langford's face. He stood half-turned toward the audience, microphone still in hand, but he had stopped performing. The practice smirk was gone now. In its place sat something far less flattering on a billionaire accustomed to controlling every room he entered: uncertainty. "This is a simulation," he said finally, forcing out a laugh that no one joined. "Let us not confuse interface movement with actual resolution." Clara did not even look at him. "Then perhaps you should ask your lead architect whether the liquidity lock was built with adaptive stress mirroring." Victor frowned. His head snapped toward the technical station where 3 members of his quantitative division now stood whispering urgently. The youngest analyst, pale and visibly rattled, answered before Victor could stop him. "It was," he admitted. "The model mirrors real market responses if parent triggers are corrected." A ripple passed through the guests. Several investors exchanged looks that were no longer amused but calculating. This was Wall Street's oldest religion. They worshipped confidence until someone smarter entered the room. Clara selected another hidden layer and exposed a risk map none of the audience had been intended to see. 12 sectors were connected by hundreds of thin glowing lines, but only 3 were pulsing at the center now. "You built complexity to impress clients," Clara said quietly. "But complexity is not intelligence. It is camouflage when the foundation is weak." A low murmur rose from the crowd. Victor's jaw tightened. That sentence had landed harder than any insult because it was spoken without emotion, like a diagnosis. Martin Sloan stepped closer to the stage, no longer pretending to be a spectator. "Langford," he said, eyes fixed on the screens, "why are there unsecured municipal exposure links buried under your medical freight assumptions?" Victor ignored him. He was staring at Clara now, really. Staring, as though trying to reconstruct who she was and how this was happening. "Who exactly are you?" he asked, and the confidence was missing entirely this time. Clara entered one final sequence. The timer above the ballroom flashed, recalculated, then turned from amber to green. System stabilized. Applicable loss reduced by 87%. The room exhaled all at once, not in celebration, but in stunned disbelief. One woman actually set her champagne down because her hand had begun trembling. 2 hedge fund managers moved closer to read the data. Victor did not move at all. His hand remained suspended around the microphone, fingers rigid, smile erased, eyes locked on the woman he had selected as a joke less than 5 minutes earlier. Clara finally placed the stylus on the console and turned toward him. "Your challenge is complete," she said. And in that frozen second, with 200 millionaires staring between them, Victor Langford felt something he had spent 20 years making sure no one else in his presence ever felt. Small. No one applauded. Applause would have required the room to admit what had just happened, and the people gathered under those chandeliers were not accustomed to witnessing power leave one person and settle so cleanly onto another. They simply stared. Victor Langford swallowed once, the movement visible in the hard line of his throat. His microphone lowered an inch. "Well," he said, attempting a smile that now looked painfully assembled, "that is certainly an impressive demonstration." His words hung in the air with all the warmth of office fluorescent lights. No one laughed. Clara Bennett stood with her hands resting lightly at her sides, not triumphant, not theatrical, just composed. That calmness unsettled Victor more than if she had smiled. People who celebrated gave you something to resist. Clara gave him nothing. Martin Sloan stepped fully to the front now, adjusting his cufflinks as he studied the green stabilization report on the screen. "Impressive," he repeated. "Victor, your team told half this room this platform was unsolvable without a 12-member intervention panel." Another investor, Janet Holloway of Holloway Capital, lifted her chin. "And she completed it in under 4 minutes." Murmurs thickened. Questions started forming, not loud yet, but sharp enough to cut. How did she access Tier 3? Why did she identify the hidden trigger instantly? Who is she? Victor felt the ballroom turning, that subtle but merciless shift in elite circles when admiration begins looking for a new host. He straightened his jacket. Miss Bennet appears to have a talent for pattern recognition, he said. We congratulate her. Clara finally spoke. This was not pattern recognition. Victor's eyes snapped to hers. Excuse me. Clara glanced up at the giant screen where the simulation architecture remained open like an exposed skeleton. I did not guess the parent trigger because I recognized a pattern, she said. I recognized it because I wrote it. The sentence landed with such force that several guests visibly leaned forward at once. Victor stared, not understanding. That is impossible, he said too quickly. Clara turned toward the technical layer and tapped the lower corner of the interface. A buried developer signature expanded onto all three screens. Designed by C. Bennett Systems Architecture. Date stamped 7 years earlier. The ballroom inhaled in unison. One analyst at Victor's station actually stepped backward. Martin Sloan let out a low whistle. Janet Holloway blinked twice, reading the signature again as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something less devastating. Victor's face drained. No, he said, quieter now. No, that cannot be right. But Clara's eyes never left him. 7 years ago, she said, your company acquired Bennett Systems through a silent asset transfer after my partner died unexpectedly. Your legal division kept the code, dissolved the brand, and removed all developer references from the public release. The room had gone so still that even the violin quartet in the corner had stopped playing. Victor remembered. Not clearly at first, but then with sickening speed. A small predictive logistics startup in Boston. Brilliant architecture. Undervalued because its founder refused venture theatrics. His acquisition attorneys had buried it. Inside Langford Quantitative Holdings before launch. He had never once met the lead designer. He had not needed to. Until now. Clara took one step closer, her voice remaining almost gentle. You challenged the wrong woman with the wrong machine, Mr. Langford. Somewhere behind Victor, a guest muttered, my God. Another whispered, he mocked the architect of his own platform. Victor opened his mouth, but nothing emerged. The billionaire who had spent the evening manufacturing humiliation now stood in front of 200 witnesses with the one expression money could never buy its way out of. Recognition. Cold, complete, and irreversible. Victor Langford had built his empire on one dangerous assumption, that ownership was the same as understanding. Buy the company, absorb the patents, bury the original names, and the brilliance became his by legal definition. It was the kind of thinking that worked beautifully on quarterly reports and investor calls. It worked less beautifully when the original mind was standing 10 feet away in a plain blue dress. Victor's lips parted, then closed again. He searched Clara Bennett's face for some hint of exaggeration, some trace of bluff, but found only the unnerving steadiness of a woman speaking from memory rather than revenge. Bennett Systems was acquired lawfully, he said at last, though even he could hear how weak the sentence sounded in a room that had stopped granting him automatic authority. Clara nodded once. I know. I signed the transfer after 6 months of litigation exhaustion and a funeral. That answer did something no market statistic had managed to do all evening. It made the room human for a second. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. Janet Holloway lowered her eyes. Martin Sloan folded his arms, no longer watching a spectacle but listening to a reckoning. Clara continued in the same calm voice. Your attorneys told me the architecture would be preserved. They told me the predictive core would remain intact because too many institutions could benefit from it. She looked up at the exposed code signature still glowing behind them. I checked the public release 1 year later. You had expanded the visual complexity, added premium licensing layers, and removed the one safeguard I insisted could not be touched. Victor said nothing. Because he remembered that too. His board had called the safeguard inefficient. It reduced aggressive leverage opportunities and made the platform less dramatic in investor demonstrations. So they stripped it. Clara turned toward the audience and touched the center of the map where 3 sectors still pulsed faintly gold. The municipal delay lock, she said, was designed to prevent panic exploitation during medical freight shortages. Without it, the system rewards institutions that move fastest while regional lenders collapse first. A banker near the rear whispered, "That is exactly what happened in the Denver test run." Heads turned. Another executive added, "And in the Singapore stress model." Victor felt coldness spread under his collar. These people were no longer merely impressed with Clara. They were connecting her words to expensive irregularities they had ignored because Langford Quantitative had seemed untouchable. Clara faced him again. "You made the model more profitable," she said, "but also more fragile." Martin Sloan gave a dry laugh. "So the unsolvable collapse Victor has been showcasing all year was self-inflicted?" No one answered because no one needed to. The evidence was blinking in green and gold across 30 feet of digital screens. Victor adjusted his grip on the microphone, then realized he was still holding it and set it down on the podium with a soft click that sounded strangely final. "Miss Bennett," he began, voice lower now, "if there were oversights, I am certain compensation can be discussed privately." Several guests exchanged glances. There it was, the oldest billionaire reflex in America: move the humiliation behind closed doors and convert it into a transaction. Clara's expression did not change. "You offered $100 million publicly," she said. "You selected me publicly. You laughed publicly." Victor froze. The words were not shouted. They were measured, almost polite, which made them land harder. Clara stepped beside the podium and looked out over the room full of tuxedos, diamonds, polished shoes, and faces that had once dismissed her in a single glance. "Then let us finish publicly." And just like that, every person in the ballroom understood the night was not over. It was only entering the part Victor Langford could no longer control. Victor Langford looked out at the ballroom and saw something he had not seen in 20 years, hesitation in the eyes of people who usually chased his approval. Martin Sloan was no longer smiling. Janet Holloway had folded her arms. Two venture chairmen near the rear were whispering behind raised hands, and Victor knew that whispering among billionaires was never harmless. It was valuation in human form. Clara Bennett reached for the wireless presentation remote lying beside the podium and lifted it with the same unhurried ease she had shown all night. "Since we are finishing publicly," she said, "I believe context matters." Victor stepped forward instinctively. "This is unnecessary." Clara looked at him. "For whom?" The question pinned him in place. A few guests shifted to get a better view. Clara pressed the remote. The giant screens behind them changed from the stabilized simulation to a dated archive file buried in the system memory. Bennett Systems prototype integrity safeguards. Internal developer notes appeared line by line. Original municipal delay lock mandatory. Regional lender protections non-removable. Medical freight panic exploit prohibited. Then, beside each note, a second layer appeared in red corporate markup from Langford Quantitative Holdings. Remove. Optionalize. Revenue restrictive. Investor flexibility preferred. The ballroom erupted, not loudly, but in a rolling storm of shocked murmurs. Martin Sloan turned slowly toward Victor. "You removed anti-panic protections to increase arbitrage margins." Janet Holloway added, "You marketed this platform to institutional clients as a resilience engine." Victor raised both hands. Those were strategic revisions approved by council and board review. Clara clicked again. Another document appeared. Annual Premium Licensing Deck. A highlighted sentence glowed in gold. Exclusive collapse prediction pathways available to Platinum subscribers. Someone near. The left side muttered, "He monetized the instability." The phrase spread through the room like smoke. Monetized the instability. Victor felt every syllable like a door closing. He tried to recover with corporate polish. All financial platforms are optimized for premium clients. That is not misconduct. That is tiered service. Clara turned toward the audience, not him. "Tiered service is one thing," she said. "Engineering preventable fragility so elite subscribers can move first while smaller institutions absorb the panic is another." No one interrupted her now. She had become the axis of the room. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving. Clara clicked once more. A chart of 3 previous stress tests appeared: Denver, Singapore, and Toronto. Each showed identical unexplained lender shocks and emergency liquidity distortions. Victor's analysts looked physically ill. One removed his glasses and rubbed both eyes. Martin Sloan exhaled sharply. Those anomalies cost my regional partners $40 million last spring. Janet Holloway's voice hardened. And my municipal clients blamed consumer withdrawals. Victor could feel the atmosphere changing from embarrassment to something far more dangerous in elite finance: collective realization. Clara lowered the remote. You asked for brilliance tonight, she said softly. But what this room is seeing is not brilliance. It is what happens when greed edits architecture. Victor stepped toward her, dropping his voice. Miss Bennett, enough. Clara did not step back. You laughed when you thought I was harmless. Victor's jaw clenched. I am asking you professionally. Clara held his gaze, and her next words were quiet enough that the room leaned in to catch them. Professional would have been honoring the work instead of stripping its conscience. The sentence hit with surgical precision. Victor turned to the crowd, perhaps hoping to find one loyal face, one investor willing to rescue him with a joke or a defense. He found none. Only narrowed eyes, tightened mouths, and billionaires silently recalculating whether Victor Langford was still an asset worth standing beside. Martin Sloan was the first to move. He stepped away from the front row and set his untouched champagne on a waiter's tray with the quiet precision of a man making a decision worth millions. Victor, he said, voice flat now, did you disclose any of this architecture modification during subscriber negotiations? Victor opened his mouth, but Janet Holloway answered before he could. He did not. Her eyes were still on the screen, scanning the red markup like a prosecutor reading a confession. Within seconds the ballroom was no longer a gala. It had become an audit disguised in tuxedos. Questions came from every direction now. Were regional risk partners informed? How many premium clients had early pathway access? Did legal approve the municipal exploit language? Each question landed faster than Victor could manufacture a polished response. He raised both hands, trying to reclaim command. Ladies and gentlemen, there are compliance explanations for all premium architecture decisions. This is not the venue for technical misunderstandings. Clara Bennett gave the faintest tilt of her head. Technical misunderstandings. She pressed the remote once more. The screen shifted again, this time to a private executive correspondence chain recovered from the archived back end. Victor recognized the subject line instantly, and the blood drained from his face before the first sentence even appeared. Subject, safeguard removal revenue upside. His own name sat beneath it. Victor Langford. The ballroom collectively inhaled. Clara read only one line, calmly, almost mercifully. Clients do not pay top-tier fees for stability. They pay for predictive advantage during instability. Remove anything that softens the crash. No one made a sound. There are moments when a room does not need shouting, because truth itself is loud enough. Victor stared at his own words 30 feet high above his head, glowing in cold white letters for every investor, banker, and acquisition rival to see. Martin Sloan slowly turned. You engineered selective panic for subscription leverage. Janet Holloway's jaw tightened. And sold us the cure. A technology mogul near the rear muttered, that is not innovation. That is manufactured dependency. Victor stepped toward Clara, but there was nowhere to step that did not feel like sinking. Those emails are proprietary context taken out of sequence, he said, and even as he spoke he knew he sounded like every executive who had already lost the room. Clara lowered the remote. No, Mr. Langford. Sequence is exactly what this evening has been about. She gestured lightly toward the giant challenge board still showing the $100 million prize. You built a public test to prove no one here could outthink your machine. Her eye shifted to the towering email behind him. Instead, your own machine remembered who built it first. Several guests actually let out stunned breaths at that. Victor looked around and saw phones now discreetly lifted. Not many. Just enough. In elite circles, public scandal did not begin with screaming. It began with documentation. One analyst from his own team quietly removed his Langford quantitative badge and slipped it into his pocket. That tiny movement hit Victor harder than any accusation. Loyalty was evaporating in real time. Clara took one final step toward center stage, her plain blue dress still the simplest thing in the room and somehow now the most commanding. "You promised $100 million to the person who could solve the collapse," she said. "I solved more than the collapse." Her gaze held his. "I solved the illusion." Victor Langford stood motionless beneath his own exposed emails, beneath the dead silence of investors who had stopped seeing him as host and started seeing him as liability, and for the first time in his carefully curated billionaire life, he understood what freezing truly felt like when there was no amount of money left to warm the room. For several seconds after Clara Bennett spoke, no one moved. The towering screen still displayed Victor Langford's own email, his own words, his own carefully buried philosophy shining over the ballroom like an indictment written in light. The violin quartet remained frozen in the corner. Waiters stood motionless with silver trays suspended midair. Even the city skyline beyond the glass walls seemed strangely distant, as if Manhattan itself had stepped back to watch a billionaire come undone. Victor tried once to speak. Nothing came. He cleared his throat and reached for the podium, but his hand stopped halfway when Martin Sloan quietly stepped in front of him. It was not an aggressive gesture. It did not need to be. In rooms like this, exclusion was always delivered politely. "I think," Martin said, adjusting his cufflink without looking at Victor, "we will need copies of every archived architecture revision before markets open on Monday." Janet Holloway nodded. "And legal disclosure on all platinum subscriber pathways." Another investor added, "Immediately." The request stacked one after another, calm, clinical, devastating. No shouting. No drama. Just billionaires withdrawing trust the way banks withdraw oxygen. Victor looked from face to face, searching for allies, but the smiles that had greeted him 2 hours earlier were gone. Some guests avoided his eyes. Others studied him with a detached curiosity reserved for collapsing companies. He was no longer the center of admiration. He was a cautionary chart forming in real time. Clara bent down and placed the wireless remote neatly beside the unused microphone. The $100 million challenge board still glowed overhead, forgotten by everyone except the man who had offered it. Victor glanced at it and seemed to remember, too late, the promise he had made while he still believed he controlled the ending. His voice came out hoarse. "Miss Bennett, the funds will be transferred." Clara looked at him, and there was no triumph in her face, only a quiet exhaustion that made the moment far heavier than celebration ever could. "Donate it," she said. Victor blinked. "What?" "To the regional lenders and medical institutions damaged by the instability pathways your revisions created." Several investors exchanged glances. Martin Sloan gave a slow nod of approval. Janet Holloway murmured, "That would be a start." Clara continued, her tone gentle enough to make every word sting more. "I did not come here for your money, Mr. Langford. I came because I was curious whether the machine still remembered its conscience, even if its owner did not." The room went silent again. Victor lowered his eyes. There are humiliations caused by insult, and then there are humiliations caused by dignity. The second kind lasts longer. Clara turned from the stage and began walking back across the marble floor, the same woman in the same plain blue dress the crowd had laughed at less than 20 minutes earlier. Yet now the guests parted instinctively to make room for her. No one whispered about catering entrances. No one smirked at her shoes. Heads inclined. Eyes followed. Respect, once denied, moved through the ballroom like a delayed current finally finding its switch. At the doorway, Clara paused only once and glanced back at the glittering room Victor had spent years using as his theater.